be peace or war?
The fateful question posed by Warren Austin, head of the United States delegation to the UN, set the mood of the world at the century's halfway mark. The seating of nationalist China's delegate on the Security Council precipitated a clash between the free nations and the Soviet bloc, which only ended with the abrupt departure of Jacob Malik, head of the Red delegation, a blunder they were to regret when the invasion of South Korea by North Korean Reds came up for consideration by the Council. In the absence of Soviet obstruction, the Security Council voted overwhelmingly in favor of armed intervention to protect the Korean Republic. It was the first police action sanctioned against an aggressor by the Parliament of Nations. In 1950, men throughout the world learned to look on the brutal face of communism. Berlin, powder keg of Europe, saw a mass demonstration of indoctrinated young Germans on May Day. France was also beset by communist-inspired strife. Red Union members adopted violent methods to prevent the unloading of Marshall Plan aid. And across the world in Japan, America's stronghold in the Pacific, the busy commies were at it again. Students went on a rampage in Tokyo with something less than successful results when opposed by Japanese police aided by occupation military police. But far more sinister to Americans was home front communism. Union Square in New York was the backdrop for these scenes of red violence. From their ranks will come the saboteurs, spies, and subversives should World War III be forced upon America. Underlining the menace from within was Valentin Gubichev, who received secret documents from Judith Kaplan, government employee. This Soviet functionary in the United Nations was deported following his conviction. But there was worse to come. A highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard, they were all but overwhelmed until the United Nations took its historic vote to intervene. While the Korean Republicans fought a desperate delaying action, a United Nations police force with General Douglas MacArthur as commander-in-chief was formed. During the early days of UN action, General MacArthur fought a grim defensive battle. His troops outnumbered 3 and 4 to 1. Stubbornly, forces under his command clung to a shrinking beachhead in Southeast Korea, and for months the Allies fought to keep from being driven into the sea. This, a savage war of attrition in which no quarter was given by a foe equipped with the latest Russian armament. It was, in fact, a war of survival to gain time. The cost was high to Americans who bore the brunt under the UN banner. For here they faced an enemy who ruthlessly slaughtered prisoners, many with their arms bound. Scores died before red guns as they stood helpless. Yes, the cost to free men came hideously high as they bought time on the rapidly narrowing perimeter of their defense. In the first months of conflict, casualties mounted with terrifying speed. But 12 nations had rallied to the United Nations banner. High on the list was Canada, which organized a special brigade of crack troops for duty wherever they might be sent by the United Nations. Thousands left for staging areas in the United States before embarking for the Korean front. With help of this kind, plus air contingents and ground forces from other nations, the tide seemed to have turned when a brilliant strategic move was made in the amphibious landing at Incheon, port city of Seoul. Between 35 and 40,000 men were landed behind the enemy's lines in an operation executed without a hitch. Seemingly, the war had reached a turning point as the fresh troops started an encircling move of the North Koreans. Well armed and equipped, they moved steadily forward toward the Manchurian border under an air cover that hammered incessantly at North Korean supply lines and industrial centers. History may well record that air power spelled the difference between victory and defeat in the opening phases of the struggle. Fair weather and foul, they ranged the skies round the clock, bombing and strafing. The end of the war seemed in sight as the Allies pushed north toward the North Korean capital of Pyongyang and further northward to the Manchurian and Siberian borders. Then it happened. The Chinese Red armies, numbering hundreds of thousands, swarmed over the frontier against thinly held United Nations positions. Confronted by overwhelming numbers, UN armies were forced into inevitable retreat, while men wondered whether Red China would touch off World War III. Again fighting a delaying action, UN troops paid heavily in casualties. Facing a foe that often outnumbered them 10 to 1, the Allies gave ground slowly, marching through temperatures that sometimes reached 20 below zero. 20,000 trapped near the Chosin Reservoir slogged and fought their way 60 bitter miles to the evacuation port of Hungnam. Through snow-clad mountains and icy passes, they held off 200,000. Would the atom bomb be the answer to the Chinese hordes? President Truman said that it was under consideration. On his word alone rested the decision to unleash this awful force. The world shuddered at the thought, for this catastrophic weapon struck fear in the minds of men all over the world. It mushroomed into the symbol of modern destruction. This man had devised. And in the year 1950, its power edged ever closer to him, leaving death in horrible form in its wake. Its harvest of misery would be limitless, sparing no one. It might well mean a world of men ever fleeing its fury, a world in which no one might again find peace and security. With troubled hearts and minds, men turned to the solace of religion and prayer. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims thronged to Rome for Holy Year. As ominous events crowded the mid-century, 5 short years after a devastating war, men of all faiths prayed for peace. And while man hoped for salvation, he could also work for it through the framework of his World Parliament, the United Nations, symbol of man's hope for tomorrow. Sports in retrospect, a look back on the sporting scene in 1952. Big news, big crowds, a big year for thrills and excitement. A slow-motion study of a favorite striding to victory in the Kentucky Derby. His name, Hill Gale, the classic colt of Calumet Farms, ridden by an old hand at Derby triumphs, Eddie Arcaro, his 5th coming up. Man and beast romping into Turfdom's Hall of Fame in 1952. A year that saw 37 out of the 47 starters come a cropper in England's pulse-tingling steeplechase, the Grand National. 4.5 miles, 30 grueling obstacles, the road to glory but for one, disaster for most of the others. The favorite has fallen, and now 13 is a lucky number for a 10-year-old named Teal, second choice of the 250,000 racing fans. Big day at Aintree, England. Boxing, and a new heavyweight champ, Rocky Marciano of Brockton, Massachusetts. Felled in the first round by the aging Jersey Joe Walcott, the 28-year-old ex-GI came back strong. In a drama-packed 13th, a right-handed jaw crusher knocked Jersey Joe loose from his senses and his title. Exit Walcott, enter Rocky Marciano. One punch gained him the richest crown of boxing. A big year in baseball, and the big story in baseball, the Yankees and their winning ways. They did it again with young stars like Mickey Mantle at the plate and veterans like Allie Reynolds on the mound. The American League leaders kept a tight grip on their World Series crown by subduing the Brooklyn Dodgers 4 games to 3. It was their 4th straight World Championship under the managerial genius of Casey Stengel. Will it be number 5 for old Case in 53? Time will tell. Football in 52, a year of upsets for some highly touted titans of the gridiron. But for Michigan State, sparked by Don McAuliffe and other top talent, it was a year of continued successes. Coach Biggie Munn's Spartans of Michigan State numbered the upset aces of Notre Dame among their many victims to run their unbeaten string to 24 and to wind up the season top team of the nation. The basketball scandals of 51 were all but forgotten by the end of the 52 season when the Cinderella team from Philadelphia, the LaSalle Explorers, captured the hearts of basketball fans in the National Invitation Tournament. The most underrated quintet of the 12 college teams entered. LaSalle took on the top-seeded teams and then took the play away from Dayton in the finals. A big upset and a big story of the year in basketball. Invitation to Jubilation in New York. Memorial Day at Indianapolis, the big day of the year for auto racing, and a big field out for fame and fortune in the 500-mile Speedway Classic on the famous brick track. Many they started, the pace was telling, and some did not finish. Bill Vukovich was leading with only 8 laps to go when this happened. And then the checkered flag signaled the emergence of a new Speedway king, the youngest driver and the heftiest, Troy Ruttman of Linwood, California. Big baby of the 500 in 1952. The water ski wizards didn't let much grass grow under their bare feet during a busy year, and many a good turn deserved another. With a daring do that bordered upon nonchalance, the aquatic slatsters hurled themselves into the fray with vim and vigor. It was the year of the big spool lash and the year of new fame for Stanley Sayers of Seattle. In his slow-motion fourth, Sayers was clocked at 185 miles an hour on the downwind leg of his record-breaking run on Lake Washington. Sayers also won racing's coveted Gold Cup, established himself as top driver of the world. His feats lured England's famed John Cobb to his death. In his jet-powered Crusader, Cobb set out on Loch Ness in Scotland to better Sayers' mark. An attempt fated to end in tragedy. Cobb raced through the measured mile at over 200, and then as the horrified crowd, his wife among them, looked on, disaster. By the time rescuers reached him, Cobb was dead. Once every 4 years, the Olympics, winter and summer of '52, the International Sports Festival produced more entries from more nations, more thrills, more records, and more harmony than any of its predecessors. German bobsledders rocketed to victory. Athletes from 30 nations vied for glory in the Winter Games at Oslo. Italy's Zino Colo took the downhill ski title, while the men's giant slalom crown went to Sten Eriksen of Norway. Andrea Meade Lawrence of Rutland, Vermont won 2 gold medals for the American team. Soaring bird-like through space, the poetry of fluid motion in the ski jump. New records and new thrills for the throngs who lined the slope. And win or lose, a picture of good sportsmanship in action. He lost his balance, he lost his skis, but he never lost his sense of humor. Big story of the Summer Olympics was the participation of Russian teams. The boys who did and died for Uncle Joe brought, along with a temporary smile of good fellowship, their own scoring system. We won, they told the home folks. Everybody else knew who won, but everybody else was busy applauding performers like Emil Zatopek of Czechoslovakia, winner of 3 events in distant racing. Zatopek's unprecedented triple victory was one of the highlights of the games that saw Uncle Sam's star-spangled athletes achieve their greatest Olympic triumph ever at Helsinki. Another standout thriller was the 100-meter dash, so close the camera had to pick the winner, Lindy Rimagino of New York. Moment of glory for winners, where masked flags and the Olympic torch were backdrops for the final act of sport's greatest drama in a great year for sports. Sellout throng of 66,000 at Miami sees Alabama get going against Syracuse in the Orange Bowl, and they never let up. Hobson heaves it into the end zone to Luna, and one of the most sensational scoring shows in bowl history is underway. The Orangemen from New York did manage to score a touchdown, just one, but then the roof fell in on them. The Crimson Tide of Alabama is on the flood this New Year's Day, won by the highest score of any bowl game. Watch this catch by Corky Tharp, and Corky keeps his feet to score another 6 for the Bama Bruisers. Halftime gave the boys from Syracuse a respite, but it wasn't long before the tide was rising again. A Syracuse 4th down kick starts the fireworks. A bit of razzle-dazzle, Bob Conway to Cecil Ingram, and away. Ingram reels off 40 yards in all before the Northerners finally managed to bring him down. On a pinch-out, Luna set sail, and the New Year's United football thrill a 61-6 victory over Syracuse. Yes, sir, it was a big day for Alabama in the Orange Bowl. 1953 for Americans was a year of change. It saw soldier-statesman Dwight D. Eisenhower take the oath of office as the nation's first Republican president in 20 years and receive the good wishes of his predecessor, Harry S. Truman. The new chief executive took the reins of government at a climactic moment in the country's history, where the solution of foreign and domestic problems pressed for early decision. With a resounding political victory behind him, he faced them with confidence. Early, however, in his term, he suffered the loss of a wise counselor and ally, for death came to Robert A. Taft, known as Mr. Republican and one of the nation's most respected leaders. His passing was mourned by all political groups. Joseph Stalin, the most powerful dictator in history, also passed from the scene, dealing world communism a heavy blow and opening a struggle for power among leaders in the Kremlin. America forged ahead in the lead in the atomic arms race. Its first piece of atomic artillery was successfully tested, hurling its atom warhead 20 miles. The atom had been harnessed for ground warfare, and a new chapter in ordnance had been written in the now familiar towering, billowing, and sinister mushroom cloud, trademark of the atomic explosion. Several of these guns already form a part of the armament of the Western European Defense Army. The year also revealed some cracks in Iron Curtain armor, with bloody riots staged by East Germans, riots which at times assumed the proportions of a revolt. Attempts by German Reds to infiltrate the West were met by savage opposition. Much of the unrest was engendered by food shipments to undernourished East Germans, which Red police and troops sought to keep from the patient thousands who braved the Red wrath. In Europe's troubled pattern, Trieste loomed large, as the conflict between Italy and Yugoslavia for the historic Adriatic area brought the massing of troops on both sides of the border. Trieste itself for weeks was the scene of rioting after the intention of the United States and Britain to withdraw their occupation troops was announced. Year's End, however, saw comparative peace established, but with Trieste still remaining a thorny problem to be solved. Nature ran wild all across the globe. America's Southwest experienced the worst drought since the grim days of the Dust Bowl era. Millions of acres of farmland were seared by the blazing sun, parched by lack of rain. President Eisenhower and Agriculture Secretary Benson met with governors of 6 stricken states to plan drought relief for thousands of hard-hit farmers. Across the Atlantic, too much water was the trouble, as the worst North Sea storms in centuries battered the coastline and breached the dikes of Holland. Thousands of square miles, ages ago wrested from the sea, were reconquered by the surging waters, a disaster that ruined some of the richest farmland in West Europe and presaged years of hardship for the people of the Low Countries, years of deprivation and arduous toil needed to win back the land from the grip of the sea. The floods took a bitter cost and material destruction, a fearful toll in human life and suffering. Earthquakes struck the fabled Ionian Isles of Greece, bringing terror and destruction in their wake. For days the earth shook. Rescue and relief forces were on the scene before the Temblors stopped, but little could avail against the awesome might of the very earth run amok. Hundreds perished in the ruins and thousands were injured as entire towns toppled. In Japan, a C-124 transport crashed on takeoff, killing 129 U.S. servicemen when it exploded and burned on impact. The worst disaster in air history. It was a grim milestone in the 50th anniversary year of aviation. Tornadoes slashed across the country, cutting a swath of destruction in a great arc from Texas through the Midwest and New England to Canada. Their savage power splintered trees, crushed buildings as with a mighty fist, tossed automobiles about with careless whim. The tornadoes wreaked havoc in one of the worst storm years on record. Historic Westminster Abbey in London, scene of colorful pomp and ceremony of empire. A bright spot in the year came with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The hopes and hearts of England and the Commonwealth went out to a young queen and to her husband, Duke Philip of Edinburgh, seeing in a second Elizabeth a revival of the glories and prestige that were England's in the days of the first Elizabethan era. A story of a queen who wrote bright pages in the story of the year.
easy peace, but peace with all came to Korea in 1953. The end of 3 years of bitter conflict and the end of bondage for prisoners of the Reds. What lay ahead, no one could foretell at year's end. But for these men, at least, the shadow of death had lifted. They were alive in Freedom Village and going home. The signing of the truce took place at Panmunjom, first step on the long and still tortuous road to ultimate solution of peace and a unified Korea. Signing for the United Nations was American General William Harrison. For the Reds, North Korea's Nam Il. But the hopes kindled this day faded as the year ran out. Many a ship sailed into many a U.S. port, bringing war-weary veterans of Korea back home again. And many were the scenes of rejoicing and reunion. The months and years of wondering and waiting fell away on days such as these, and the heart was filled to overflowing. Men who had fought for liberty were welcomed back into her arms in 1953, fateful year of transition.
As 1958 began, America sent aloft its first Earth satellite, the Explorer, drawing abreast of Soviet science with 3 more successful launchings during the year. Then in December, an Atlas ballistic missile guided itself into orbit to become by far the biggest artificial moon. Even more impressive, it carried a tape recording broadcasting to the world the President's message of peace.
Man was pushing back frontiers on Earth as well. The atomic submarine Nautilus cruised under the Arctic ice and the North Pole itself. An historic underwater voyage from Hawaii to England. Her sister sub, the Skate, also cruised under the pole, while the nuclear Seawolf set a 60-day underwater endurance record. But Commander Anderson and his men of the Nautilus took first honors for pioneering what may be a key trade lane of the future, demonstrating the awesome power of the nuclear submarine and dramatically directing attention to the strategic Northlands. Fittingly, in that same year, 1958, Alaska finally won its long-sought statehood. Alaskans celebrated with an enthusiasm recalling sourdough days. A new state, twice as large as Texas, joined the Union. And a bright new star was added to the 48. Vice President and Mrs. Nixon toured South America and encountered rabid anti-Americanism, touched off by political ferment and economic troubles. Caracas mobs attacked Mr. Nixon in his car in a shocking climax to his tour. Earlier, communist-led mobs in Peru had stoned the Vice President. Perhaps the prime candidate for Man of the Year was Charles de Gaulle. He returned to the premiership after France came to the brink of civil war when army forces and rightist settlers in strife-torn Algeria seized control and repudiated the Paris government. Given sweeping powers, the general decreed a vacation from politics for France while he prepared a new constitution. The Fifth Republic came into being with an overwhelming Gaullist majority in the new National Assembly. Once again, Charles de Gaulle was his nation's man of destiny. The Brussels Fair was a contest for international prestige, and the graceful, airy United States Pavilion, with its cheerful showcasing of America's everyday life, stood in favorable contrast to the looming Soviet exhibition hall. America won a triumph on the cultural front, but the Kremlin in 1958 took the initiative in the global power struggle. Khrushchev's wooing of Gamal Abdel Nasser brought new upheavals in the Middle East. Strengthened by Soviet arms and economic aid, Nasser began the year by joining Egypt and Syria into the new United Arab Republic. Pan-Arabism was on the march. Nasser was his prophet, and there was dire peril for friends of the West, such as King Faisal of Iraq and his uncle Prince Abdul Ilah, whose attempted united front with Hussein of Jordan was ended by an army-led revolt in Iraq. Faisal, his uncle, and Premier Nouri es-Said, 3 of Nasser's staunchest foes, were slain in a wave of shocking violence. Neighboring Lebanon, torn by Nasser-incited rebellion, called for aid, and United States Marines landed near Beirut. The landings were only a few hours by air from Soviet frontiers. A possible Red attack was the calculated risk of this bold response to Lebanon's call for help. Marines, by their very presence, were a stabilizing force. The government restored order so that free elections could be held. The crisis passed, and Russia's denunciations and demands for a summit meeting abruptly faded as Red China provoked a new crisis in the Strait of Formosa. Communist guns launched a massive barrage against the Quemoy Island group, nationalist islands barely 3 miles offshore. 50,000 shells landed in one day, beginning a rain of fire intended to cut off supply shipments. To counter the blockade by barrage and the threat of invasion, the U.S. 7th Fleet was reinforced. The mightiest naval force ever assembled, it shepherded Chinese supply convoys to the edge of territorial waters. At first, landing craft were unable to pierce the curtain of fire, but as stockpiled food and supplies ran dangerously low, more and more convoys and airlifts got through. The balance shifted, red gunfire grew sporadic, and the Cold War pressure again shifted abruptly, now to West Berlin, that enclave of freedom 110 miles behind the Iron Curtain. The Free City was a showcase for democracy and capitalism, its obvious prosperity in two-pointed contrast to the regimentation and shabby poverty of the Soviet Hill sector. Red militiamen drilled amid the rubble of World War II. Much of East Berlin is still unreconstructed after more than a decade. Under Den Linden, pre-war Avenue of Elegance typified East Berlin's plight, as Russia demanded that Berlin be neutralized and made free of four-power control. The Soviet flag no longer flew before the Allied Kommandatura as Khrushchev's 6-month deadline drew near. The stage was set for another Berlin blockade, or worse, in a bold Soviet gambit threatening the entire balance of power on the continent. The death of Pope Pius, shown with Cardinal Spellman in some of the last films of the Pontiff, stilled one of the world's great voices for humanity. In an age of crisis, he had been among the champions of human rights and the cause of peace. The mourning of 500 million Catholics for the deceased pontiff was followed by keen anticipation as the College of Cardinals met to choose Pius' successor. It was Angelo Cardinal Roncalli who assumed the triple crown of Pope John the 23rd, a weighty burden in time of continuing peril to the hopes of all mankind for freedom and peace.